The pen was already on the table in my own kitchen before I understood what it was there for. Not a pen I owned, a heavy black one, the kind lawyers use for signatures that are supposed to feel inevitable. Vanessa was standing behind it with her arms crossed, and beside her stood a woman I had never met, holding a leather folder and a small blue notary stamp like it was a badge. "Sign it, Mom," Vanessa said. Her voice was flat, rehearsed, like she had practiced it in the car. "Sign the transfer or you will never see the kids again." I stood in the house I had lived in for 41 years, in the kitchen where I had made her birthday cakes and bandaged her scraped knees, and I listened to my only daughter threaten me with my own grandchildren. I did not sit down. I did not reach for the pen. I looked at the paper on the table, a quitclaim deed, freshly typed, drawn up by somebody else's lawyer, waiting on my signature to hand over Maple Hollow, our cottage on Lake Serrano, the one Walter's father built with his hands in 1978, and Walter expanded with his own in 1995. And I felt something in my chest go very, very quiet. "No," I said. That was all. One word. And Vanessa's face did something I will never forget. A flicker of disbelief, like she genuinely had not accounted for the possibility that I would refuse. Preston, standing by the window with his phone in his hand, did not even look up. "Vanessa," he said quietly, "we talked about this." "I know what we talked about," she snapped. The notary excused herself first, then Preston, then, finally, Vanessa, who paused at my front door and said the words that would echo in my head for the next 4 months. "You'll regret this, Mom. You have no idea what you just did." She was wrong about that. I had a very clear idea of what I had just done. I had said no to the 2 people who believed, down to their bones, that an old woman living alone with a lake house and a pension was an easy problem to solve. What they did not know, what none of them knew, not even Vanessa, who thought she understood every inch of my life, was that I had already solved a much bigger problem, 5 years before they ever sat that pen down on my table. If you have ever had to hold your ground against your own family and pay for it in silence, I want you to know, you are not alone, and I am about to tell you exactly what happens next. My name is Eleanor Whitfield. I am 71 years old, and this is the story of the winter my daughter tried to take my husband's cottage and the 4 months of silence that followed. A silence I did not spend crying. I spent it working. Let me take you back, not to the kitchen table with the pen on it, further back, to when none of this seemed possible. Back when Vanessa was still just my daughter and not yet a stranger wearing her face. I met Walter Whitfield in 1976 at a county fair in Ashford Falls, Michigan, of all places, standing in line for lemonade. He was 24, sunburned across the back of his neck, and he made me laugh so hard I spilled lemonade on my own shoes. We married 18 months later. His father owned a modest parcel of land on the northern shore of Lake Serrano, a stretch of pine and rock nobody wanted because the road in was unpaved for the first 3 miles. Walter's father began building a cabin there in 1978 with his own 2 hands, 1 board at a time over 4 summers. He called it Maple Hollow because of the sugar maples that ringed the property, and every October the whole hillside turned the color of a struck match. When his father passed in 1994, Walter inherited the cabin, and the very next year he expanded it, added a 2nd bedroom, a stone fireplace he built himself over one brutal August, and a wraparound porch that faced the water. I remember standing on that porch the day he finished it, watching him hammer the last board into place, sweat soaking through his shirt, grinning at me like a boy. "This is for our girl," he told me. "Someday, for her kids too. Our girl was Vanessa, born in 1982, the only child we ever had after 2 miscarriages that nearly broke us both. I do not say that to excuse what came later. I say it because I need you to understand that Vanessa was never unloved. She was, if anything, loved carefully, deliberately, by 2 people who had learned the hard way not to take a child for granted. She grew up spending every summer at Maple Hollow. Sunburns, mosquito bites, bonfires, her father teaching her to skip stones off the dock. She loved that place. I want to be honest about that, because it matters later. Vanessa Whitfield, before she became Vanessa Cole, loved that cottage the way you love a place that raised you. Something shifted, though, somewhere in her 20s. I have turned it over in my mind more times than I can count, trying to find the exact moment, and I do not think there was one single moment. I think it was closer to erosion. Small things, over years, wearing away at something that used to be solid. She married Preston Cole in 2008. He was handsome in the way that photographs well. Good jaw, easy smile, the kind of confidence that reads as competence until you have watched it up close for a decade. He worked in real estate development, always talking about the next big project, always dressed one notch nicer than the room required. Walter liked him at first. I was more careful. I remember telling Walter quietly after their wedding, "That boy talks about money the way some men talk about God." Walter laughed it off. "He's ambitious, Elle. Nothing wrong with ambitious." Maybe there wasn't. Not at first. They had Caleb in 2009 and Sophie in 2017, the same year, as it happened, that Walter died. A heart attack, sudden, on a Tuesday morning in March while he was clearing brush at Maple Hollow, the place he loved more than almost anywhere on earth. I was inside making coffee. By the time I got out to the yard, he was already gone. 71 hours later, we buried him under a stand of pines a half-mile from the cottage, per his wishes, and I became a widow at 63, in a house that suddenly had far too many empty rooms. Sophie was 2 months old at the funeral. Caleb was 8, old enough to understand that Grandpa was not coming back, not old enough to understand why. I remember him tugging on my sleeve at the reception and asking, in the flat, direct way only children manage, "Grandma, are you going to die too?" I told him not for a very long time. I have tried very hard to keep that promise. Losing Walter changed me in ways I am still discovering. It also, I would learn much later, changed how Vanessa and Preston looked at me, not as a mother anymore, exactly, but as an asset with a shrinking shelf life. I did not see that at the time. Grief made me slow to notice things I should have caught immediately. There was one person who saw it faster than I did. Harold Jennings had been Walter's lawyer and closest friend for 30 years, a small firm attorney in downtown Ashford Falls who had drafted every will, every deed, every legal document our family had ever needed. He came to the funeral in a gray suit that hung a little loose on his frame, hugged me for a long moment on the church steps, and said something I did not fully understand until years later. "Eleanor," he said, "when you're ready, and only when you're ready, I need to talk to you about the cottage. Not today, but soon." I remember thinking at the time that it was strange timing for legal talk. I did not yet know how right he was to raise it when he did, or how much that single conversation, 6 weeks later, in his cramped office above the hardware store on Main Street, would end up protecting everyone I loved. But before I tell you about that conversation, I need you to understand what was happening on the other side of my family during that same stretch of grief. Because while I was learning to live alone in a house too quiet for one person, Preston Cole was quietly building the kind of financial trouble that men like him always insist they can outrun. He had launched a development project the year before Walter died, something he called Coal Ridge Estates, 40 planned lots on a bluff 20 minutes outside of town. Luxury builds, the kind of glossy brochure language that promises elevated living and delivers, more often than not, a half-finished road and a lawsuit. He needed capital. He always needed capital. And in the months after my husband's funeral, while Vanessa was bringing me casseroles and sitting with me on Sunday afternoons, Preston was quietly running numbers on what my late husband's cottage might be worth as collateral. I did not know that then. I want to be very clear about that. In 2017, I thought I was simply grieving alongside my daughter. I had no idea that somewhere in a spreadsheet on Preston Cole's laptop, Maple Hollow already had a dollar figure attached to it. $415,000. An appraisal he had quietly commissioned that August, 3 months before I had even started sleeping through the night again. That is where we begin. A widow, a grieving daughter, a son-in-law with a spreadsheet, and a cottage full of a dead man's fingerprints that nobody had told me was already being measured for parts. What happened next took 6 weeks to set in motion, 5 years to fully mature, and about 4 months to finally detonate. And I promise you, every single beat of it is coming. 6 weeks after Walter's funeral, I sat in Harold Jennings's office above the hardware store, in a chair that had been there since the Reagan administration, watching him arrange a folder on his desk with the careful precision of a man who has delivered difficult news for 40 years and has never once enjoyed it. "Before we start," he said, "I want to make sure you actually know what you own, because most widows who sit in that chair do not, and it matters more than anything else we are going to talk about today." He opened the folder and turned it toward me. Inside was a photocopy of a deed, stamped and recorded at the Ashford County Register of Deeds in the spring of 1995. When Walter inherited this place from his father, he came straight to me and had me redraw the deed into both your names, as tenants by the entirety. Husband and wife, one undivided whole with right of survivorship. That means Maple Hollow never went into probate when he died. It did not pass under his will, and no court had to bless it. It became yours the moment he stopped breathing. I filed his death certificate with the register myself in April, so the record is clean and public. As of this morning, Eleanor, you are the sole owner of that cottage. Not Vanessa, not anyone. I had not known that. I had assumed, the way you assume things about a marriage, that the cottage was simply ours and had stayed ours, without ever once thinking about which piece of paper made it so. "Good," Harold said. "Now hold on to that, because here is the question I actually called you in for." He folded his hands. "What happens to Maple Hollow when you're gone?" I told him what I assumed, that it would go to Vanessa, same as everything else, same as it always would have. Harold nodded slowly, the way he did when he was deciding how much to say. "And what happens to it," he asked, "if Vanessa's marriage runs into trouble? Debt, a lawsuit, a divorce? Under Michigan law, as it stands right now, that cottage becomes fair game the moment it's in her name outright. A creditor, an ex-spouse, a business partner suing Preston? Any of them could put a lien on it, force a sale, take Walter's cabin apart board by board to settle somebody else's debt." I remember going very still in that chair. "Preston's business is fine," I said, though even as I said it, I heard how thin it sounded. Harold did not argue with me. He simply slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. A public records printout, a notice of a mechanic's lien filed against Coal Ridge Estates that spring, $11,000 owed to a paving contractor who had walked off the job unpaid. "Might be nothing," Harold said carefully. "Might be growing pains. But Eleanor, I watched men do this to their own families for 30 years, and it never once looked like danger until it was standing in the living room. I sat with that for a long moment, looking out his window at Main Street below, at the hardware store's awning flapping in a May wind. And then I asked him what I could do. What Harold proposed was not complicated, though it took him weeks to draft properly and took me the better part of 2 years after that to be ready to actually sign it. An irrevocable trust, the Whitfield family trust, he called it, naming Caleb and Sophie as the ultimate beneficiaries of Maple Hollow, with myself retaining a documented lifetime right to use, occupy, and receive any income from the property for as long as I lived. Once I signed it, the cottage would no longer be mine to give away, sell, or mortgage on a whim. And critically, it would never pass through Vanessa's estate or Vanessa's marriage at all. It would skip her entirely and land protected in trust for her children. Why not leave it to Vanessa the normal way? I asked him. She's my daughter, Harold. This feels like I'm cutting her out. You're not cutting her out of anything, Harold said gently. She was never going to lose the cottage under this plan. Her children were always going to have it. That never changes. What changes is that nobody else, no creditor, no husband, no lawsuit, can ever touch it first. You are protecting her inheritance from the exact kind of situation her husband's business is currently flirting with. If I'm wrong about Preston, Eleanor, you've lost nothing. If I'm right, you've saved everything. I signed the Whitfield Family Trust on the 14th of September, 2019. In that same cramped office, with Harold's paralegal as a witness and a notary public from the county clerk's office I had never met before or since. Harold recorded the new deed into the trust with the Register of Deeds the following week, and kept the original trust instrument in his firm's fireproof safe. I kept a copy in a locked drawer of my writing desk at home, tucked behind old photographs Vanessa had never once asked to see. I did not tell Vanessa. I want to be honest about that, because I have asked myself many times since whether that silence was a mistake. Harold advised against telling her, at least not yet. If Preston's business is in real trouble, he said, the last thing you want is for that information to travel back to him before the ink is even dry. Let it sit quietly. Protect them first. Explain later, when you're ready, on your own terms. I told myself I would explain eventually. A holiday dinner, maybe, once the grief had settled and the words came easier. I did not yet know that eventually would arrive 5 years later, in the ugliest possible way, across a kitchen table with a stranger's pen on it. For a while, life simply continued. Vanessa and Preston kept the same rhythm most families do. Birthdays, Thanksgivings, a 4th of July at the cottage every summer, where Caleb grew half a foot a year and Sophie learned to swim off our dock the same way her mother had. I watched my grandchildren grow up in the same water Walter had taught Vanessa to skip stones across, and for a long stretch, I believed the hardest part of my life was already behind me. I was wrong about that, too. But the cracks, when they started showing, were small enough that I mistook them for ordinary family friction rather than the beginning of something deliberate. It started, as far as I can trace it, at Thanksgiving in 2022. We were gathered at my house. Vanessa insisted on hosting less and less as the years went on, always some excuse about Preston's schedule. And dinner had gone reasonably well until Preston, 3 glasses of wine into the evening, leaned back in his chair and said to the whole table, "You know, Eleanor's basically sitting on a gold mine up at that lake. 400 grand of prime real estate, and it just sits there empty 11 months a year. I laughed it off at the time. It's not empty, Preston. I go up in the summer. I remember that pause after I said it, because it was longer than it should have been. Preston did not answer right away. He simply smiled at me over the rim of his wine glass, the way a man smiles when he already knows the conversation is going to end up exactly where he wants it. And in that small gap of silence, my mind went somewhere else entirely, the way it sometimes does at family dinners, when the present moment gets crowded out by an older one that will not stay quiet. I was thinking about the Thanksgiving before Walter died, 2016. My sister Ruth had still been alive then, and she'd driven up from Toledo with a pecan pie that never quite set right, and we'd laughed about it for years afterward. Walter had carved the turkey at that same table, the same chair Preston was sitting in now, and Vanessa had been 7 months pregnant with Sophie, glowing, teasing her father about which grandchild he loved more before either of them had even been born. "The one who isn't born yet always wins," Walter had said, deadpan, and the whole table had laughed. I remember thinking that year that I had built a good life, a whole one, a life with enough love in it to spare. 6 years later, I was sitting in that same dining room at that same table, listening to my son-in-law describe my dead husband's cottage as dead equity, while my daughter cut her turkey in silence beside him. I want to tell you about the rest of that table, because I think it matters, because the moment did not happen in isolation, the way I sometimes compress it in my memory. There were 7 of us that year. Doris Hutchins, my neighbor of 20 years, had come, the same Doris who would later witness my journal entries during the 4 months of silence, though neither of us had any idea that night how much we would come to lean on each other. Caleb was 13 then, quiet, already tall for his age, more interested in the football game playing silently on the television in the next room than in anything the adults were discussing. Sophie was 5, seated on 2 stacked couch cushions so she could reach the table, more focused on arranging her green beans into a smiling face than on the conversation happening over her head. Doris told me afterward, in the kitchen while we were doing dishes, that she'd nearly said something to Preston herself. "I almost told him it wasn't his place," she said, drawing a serving platter with more force than the platter strictly required. "Eleanor, that man talked about your home like it was a stock he was thinking of shorting." "It's fine, Doris," I told her that night, and I believed it, mostly. "He's under a lot of pressure with his business. People say strange things when they're stressed." I have thought about that conversation many times since, about how quick I was to build him an excuse he had not earned and had not asked for. I think, looking back, that this was the shape grief had left me in. A woman so relieved to still have family gathered around her table at all, 2 years after burying her husband, that she was willing to overlook almost anything rather than risk the silence getting any bigger than it already was. Doris was not fooled the way I let myself be. She dried the platter, set it down, and looked at me directly. "Eleanor, I've known you since before Walter passed. I watched you grieve that man for 2 years. I am not going to stand here and pretend I didn't just watch your son-in-law price your cottage over Thanksgiving dinner like he was standing at an auction house." I did not have an answer for her that night. I simply dried my hands, hung up the dish towel, and went back out to the dining room, where the conversation had moved on to something else. Caleb's basketball season, Sophie's kindergarten teacher, ordinary things. The kind of small talk that lets a family paper over a moment nobody wants to sit inside for very long. But Preston was not finished. I want to be honest about that too, because for years afterward, whenever I retold this story to Harold, or later to Dr. Foss during my evaluation, I found myself wanting to soften this part, to make it sound smaller than it was. It was not small. It was the first thread in a rope that would eventually be strong enough to nearly hang my whole family from it. He set his wine glass down with a small, deliberate click against the tablecloth, the kind of sound a man makes when he wants the table's attention without having to ask for it outright. And he looked at me. Not unkindly, that was the strange part. He never once looked unkind while he was doing this. The way a man looks at a problem he has already decided he is entitled to solve. I should say something here about the house we were sitting in that night, because I think it explains something about why Preston felt so comfortable saying what he said. My own house, the one on Larkspur Lane where I had lived for over 40 years, was modest. A 3-bedroom colonial, nothing remarkable. The kind of house that had been solidly middle class in 1983 when Walter and I bought it, and had simply aged alongside us since. The furniture was mostly original. The kitchen had been updated exactly once, in 2005, with cabinets that were already starting to look dated again. I tell you this not out of any embarrassment, but because I think Preston looked at that house, compared it in his head to the appraisal figure he had already quietly run on Maple Hollow, and drew a conclusion that felt, to him, entirely reasonable. An elderly widow, living modestly, sitting on $400,000 of lake property she used 6 weeks a year. In his mind, I imagine, it must have looked less like theft and more like an inefficiency waiting to be corrected. That is the particular cruelty of men like Preston Cole, I have come to understand. They rarely think of themselves as taking anything. They think of themselves as fixing something broken, some slack left in the system by people too sentimental or too slow to see the obvious solutions sitting right in front of them. It would take me 2 more years, and a great deal of documentation, to fully understand how deliberately that framing had been constructed, and how long he had been building toward the moment he finally said it out loud. "I'm not trying to be harsh, Eleanor," Preston said that Thanksgiving, and I remember the particular gentleness in his voice, the tone men use when they want cruelty to sound like concern. "I just think about it from a numbers perspective. That's how my brain works. And from a numbers perspective, that cottage sitting there mostly empty just doesn't make a lot of sense." Vanessa still said nothing. I looked at her, waiting, the way a mother waits for her child to defend something that matters, and she simply kept her eyes on her plate, moving a piece of turkey around without eating it. I did not understand, that night, what I would only understand much later. That she was not staying silent out of disloyalty to me. She was staying silent because she was already frightened, already aware in some half-formed way of how much financial trouble her husband was quietly carrying, and some instinct in her had already decided it was safer not to ask questions she was not ready to hear the answers to. I did not know any of that yet. All I knew, sitting at my own table on Thanksgiving of 2022, was that my son-in-law had just described my dead husband's life's work as an inefficiency, and my daughter had let him. Caleb spoke up unprompted, the way only a 13-year-old can manage, cutting cleanly through the tension without seeming to notice it was there at all. "I like the cottage empty," he said, not looking up from his plate. "It's quiet there. You can hear the water at night." I have held on to that sentence for years now. A 13-year-old boy, at a table full of adults maneuvering around each other's fears and ambitions, simply telling the truth about what that place meant to him. Not an asset, not dead equity, not a number on a spreadsheet, but a place where you could hear the water at night. Sophie, 5 years old and only half listening, added her own contribution without looking up from her green beans. "I like when Grandma lets me feed the ducks." The table laughed, the tension broke, the way it does at family dinners when children accidentally rescue a conversation the adults have let go wrong. Preston laughed too, easily, refilled his wine, and the subject moved on to Caleb's basketball season, exactly the way these things always seem to move on in my family. A hard thing said, a child's innocence smoothing over the cracks, everyone agreeing without discussion to let the moment pass rather than examine it. I let it pass too. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think it matters for understanding everything that came after. I had every opportunity that Thanksgiving to say clearly and firmly that the cottage was not open for discussion, that it belonged to Walter's memory and to his grandchildren's future and to no one's balance sheet. I did not say it. I laughed along, cleared the dessert plates, hugged everyone goodbye at the door, and told myself, the way I had been telling myself variations of the same thing for 2 years, that it was simply stress talking, that Preston did not mean anything serious by it, that families said uncomfortable things sometimes, and it did not have to mean anything was actually wrong. Doris caught my arm on the porch as she was leaving that night, the cold air already carrying the first bite of the winter to come. "Eleanor," she said quietly, "I've buried 2 husbands, and I've watched a lot of families come apart at tables just like that one. I'm only going to say this once, and then I'll let it go. Watch that man. Not because I think he's evil, because I think he's desperate, and desperate men convince themselves of things." She pulled her coat tighter and looked out at the dark yard for a moment before she said the rest of it. "And Eleanor, being useful to your family is not the same thing as being loved by them. The day you stop being useful is the day you find out which one you had." I told her I would. I did not. Not really. Not with the seriousness the moment deserved. It would take another comment, at a basketball game the following spring, and then another, on a phone call the spring after that, before the pattern finally became impossible for me to keep explaining away as stress or wine or an ordinary son-in-law's ordinary opinions about money. But Preston was not finished, not that night and not in the years that followed, and even as I stood on my own porch watching Doris's headlights pull out of the driveway, some quiet, unacknowledged part of me had already begun keeping score. I have skipped over one exchange from that table, and I want to go back for it now, because it is the sentence of Preston's I have never once been able to shake. When I told him the cottage was not empty, that I went up there in the summers, he had his answer ready before I finished speaking. "For 6 weeks," he said, smiling in that easy, photogenic way of his. 6 weeks a year for $400,000 of dead equity. If that were mine, I'd have it working for me." "It's not a stock portfolio, Preston," I said. "It's the house your father-in-law built with his own hands." Vanessa did not defend me. That is the part I remember most clearly, more than Preston's comment itself. My daughter sitting there, cutting into her turkey, saying nothing at all while her husband appraised her dead father's cabin out loud at my own dinner table. I told myself it was the wine talking. I told myself a great many things over the following 2 years, each time some version of that comment resurfaced. Preston mentioning, at Caleb's junior varsity basketball game, that some families just let good assets rot instead of leveraging them. Vanessa, on a phone call in the early spring of 2024, asking almost casually whether I had ever thought about what happens to the cottage when you're older, Mom, like, realistically. I answered vaguely each time. I did not yet understand that I was being surveyed, slowly, the way a buyer walks a property before making an offer. What I did not know, what I would not learn until much later, from documents Harold and I gathered together, was that Coleridge Estates had quietly collapsed in the spring of 2023. Not a sudden failure, a slow one. 2 more mechanics liens, a private lender named Garrett Holt who had put $280,000 into the project and was now, by that summer, calling Preston's cell phone every single week. Preston had exhausted a home equity line on his and Vanessa's own house. He had, according to records we would later obtain, applied for and been rejected from 3 separate business loans, each rejection citing insufficient collateral. $415,000 of insufficient collateral was sitting undisturbed on the shore of Lake Serrano in his mother-in-law's name. I did not know any of this while it was happening. I only knew that the comments about the cottage kept coming, a little more pointed each time, and that Vanessa had started asking to come by and talk more often than she ever had before. Always alone, always with a faint nervousness in her voice that I mistook, God help me, for the beginning of closeness. Harold noticed something was wrong before I did. In March of 2024, he called me out of nowhere. We still spoke every few months, old habit from Walter's years, checking in the way old friends do, and asked, almost offhand, whether Vanessa or Preston had ever asked me about the cottage's ownership structure. Vanessa asked something like that a few weeks ago, I admitted. Whether the cottage was just mine or whether it was set up some special way. I told her it was mine, which, Harold, it is mine, isn't it? I mean, I still live there every summer. I pay the taxes. It's yours to use for as long as you live, Eleanor, exactly like we planned, Harold said carefully. But it is legally held in an irrevocable trust for Caleb and Sophie. You cannot sign it away, sell it, or mortgage it, even if you wanted to. Did you tell her that? I hadn't. I had simply said it was mine because in every way that mattered to my daily life, it felt like mine. I had never gotten around to that conversation I kept promising myself I would have, the one where I sat Vanessa down and explained, gently, why I had done what I did, and how it protected her children no matter what happened to anyone else's finances. I think you need to have that conversation soon, Harold said. Sooner than soon. Eleanor, I don't like the pattern I'm hearing. I told him I would. I meant to, but life, as it does, kept interrupting. A knee replacement that spring that had me laid up for 6 weeks, a friend's illness that took up my summer, the ordinary business of being 70 years old in a body that no longer moved as fast as my intentions did. The conversation I kept promising myself never happened. Instead, in the first week of November 2024, Vanessa called and asked if she could come by that Saturday afternoon, the second Saturday of the month, to talk about something important. I told her, of course, come for lunch. I would make the chicken soup she used to love as a girl. I had no idea I was setting the table for an ambush. That Saturday is the day I opened this story with. The pen on the table, the notary in the leather folder, my daughter's voice telling me to sign or lose my grandchildren. I want to walk you through it properly now, because there is more to that afternoon than I told you at the start, and what happened in the 90 minutes after she walked through my door is where everything truly begins. Vanessa arrived at noon, but Preston and the notary did not come in with her. They waited in the car for nearly 20 minutes while Vanessa sat across from me at the kitchen table, eating soup she barely touched, working up to something. I could see it in her hands. She kept folding and refolding the paper napkin beside her bowl, a nervous habit she had had since childhood. Mom, she finally said, Preston and I need to talk to you about something serious, financially serious. She told me, in halting pieces, about Coleridge Estates, about the lender, Garrett Holt, and the $280,000 Preston owed him, now with interest accruing at a rate she either did not understand or chose not to explain clearly. About a bridge solution Preston had worked out with a private financing company, one that would let them refinance using the cottage as collateral, just temporarily, just until the last few lots at Coleridge sold. It's not permanent, Mom, she said. It's a safety net. And honestly, it would help us so much. You barely use the place anymore. "Vanessa," I said carefully, "the cottage isn't set up the way you think it's set up." Her face changed. Not confusion, something sharper. "What does that mean?" I told her, as gently as I could manage with my heart hammering, about the trust Harold had drafted and I had signed back in 2019, about Caleb and Sophie being named as the beneficiaries, about the fact that I legally could not do what she was asking even if I wanted to. I watched her face go through disbelief, then something like betrayal, as though I had been the one keeping a secret from her, which, I will admit, in a sense, I had. For a moment, Vanessa did not say anything at all. She simply sat very still, her hands frozen mid-fold around that paper napkin, staring at me the way you might stare at someone who has just told you the ground beneath your childhood home was never as solid as you believed. Outside, through the kitchen window, I could see Preston's car still idling in the driveway, exhaust curling white against the cold November air. And I remember thinking, in the strange, detached way the mind sometimes works during moments like that, how odd it was that something so enormous was unfolding in a kitchen that still smelled like chicken soup. I have tried, many times since, to reconstruct exactly how long that silence lasted. Harold once asked me the same question during one of our Tuesday sessions, wanting to understand the full shape of that afternoon for the file he was building. And I found I genuinely could not answer him with any precision. It might have been 10 seconds. It might have been a full minute. Grief and shock have a way of stretching time strangely, the way a single second can hold an entire lifetime of feeling. And I have come to believe that whatever the clock actually recorded, it felt to me like standing at the edge of something very tall, looking down, waiting to see which direction I would fall. I watched my daughter's face during that silence more closely than I have ever watched anything in my life. I watched the particular way her jaw tightened, a habit she had carried since she was perhaps 6 years old, the exact expression she used to make when a toy broke or a promise went unkept, before she had learned to disguise disappointment behind composure. I watched her eyes move, almost involuntarily, toward the kitchen window, toward the idling car in the driveway where her husband waited, as though some part of her were silently asking him for instructions she could not yet hear. I thought, in that stretched, uncertain moment, about all the versions of this conversation I had rehearsed in my head over the years and never once delivered. I had imagined, more than once, sitting Vanessa down at this very table on some ordinary Sunday afternoon, no crisis attached to it at all, and explaining calmly, gently, why Harold and I had done what we did, framing it not as a secret kept from her, but as a gift given quietly to her own children, the way a parent sometimes plants a tree they know they will never sit fully in the shade of. I had imagined her nodding, understanding, perhaps even grateful once the shock wore off, that her mother had thought so far ahead on her family's behalf. I had never once imagined delivering that explanation across a kitchen table with a stranger's pen and a notary waiting in a car outside, because her husband needed $400,000 he did not have and had run out of gentler ways to ask for it. I thought, too, about Walter, the way I often did in moments that required more steadiness than I felt I currently possessed. I thought about the particular quiet way he used to handle difficult conversations, never raising his voice, never rushing to fill an uncomfortable silence just to relieve his own discomfort. He had a gift for letting a hard truth simply sit in a room until the other person was ready to receive it, rather than chasing them with it. I had spent nearly 40 years married to that patience, had absorbed some fraction of it myself over the decades, and I found myself reaching for it now, in this kitchen, at this table, without my husband beside me to model it directly. I noticed small things during that silence, the way you sometimes notice small things during the largest moments of your life, almost as a way of steadying yourself against the enormity of what is actually happening. The soup in Vanessa's bowl had gone cold, a thin skin forming across the surface where the chicken fat had settled. The kitchen clock above the stove, the same clock Walter had hung there in 1987, read 14 minutes past 1. Somewhere down the block, a dog was barking, the same ordinary sound of an ordinary Saturday afternoon, entirely indifferent to the fact that inside my kitchen, an entire family's understanding of itself was quietly coming apart at the seams. I thought about calling Harold in that moment, some instinct telling me I should have him on the phone before Preston came inside with whatever he had planned. I did not. Some other instinct, quieter but more insistent, told me that this conversation, at least this first part of it, needed to happen between mother and daughter alone, without a lawyer's careful language standing between us, however useful that language would prove to be later. I want to be honest with you about something else I felt in that silence, something that surprised me even as I felt it. Beneath the fear, beneath the grief of watching my daughter's face rearrange itself around a betrayal she believed I had committed, there was something else, something smaller, quieter, almost embarrassed to exist alongside everything larger happening in that kitchen. A kind of relief. 5 years of carrying that secret alone. 5 years of half-finished sentences and postponed conversations. And here, finally, whether I had chosen the moment or not, the truth was finally standing in the room between us, plainly, with nowhere left to hide. I do not say that to suggest I was glad the moment arrived the way it did. I was not. I would have given almost anything to have had that conversation on my own terms, years earlier, in a kitchen that did not have a strange car idling in the driveway outside it. But there was a strange, unexpected clarity in finally not having to manage the secret anymore, in finally letting my daughter see the full shape of a decision I had been quietly protecting her children with since she was 37 years old, and had no idea her mother was capable of protecting anyone from anything. Vanessa's hands finally moved again, releasing the napkin they had been frozen around, smoothing it flat against the table with a kind of deliberate, controlled slowness that told me she was working very hard to keep something larger from breaking loose inside her. I recognized that particular control. I had used it myself, more than once, in rooms where falling apart was not an option I could afford. I thought, watching her, about all the years I had told myself that Vanessa's occasional distance, her hurried phone calls, her increasingly rare visits, were simply the ordinary texture of an adult daughter's busy life. A husband, 2 children, a household to run, 100 small demands pulling her attention in directions that had nothing to do with me. I wondered now, in this new light, how much of that distance had actually been fear. Fear of a husband's mounting debts she did not fully understand. Fear of a marriage quietly buckling under weight she could not name out loud, not even to her own mother. I felt something soften in me toward her, even as another part of me remained entirely resolved about what I would and would not do that afternoon. I thought, finally, about Caleb and Sophie, though neither of them were anywhere near that kitchen table. I thought about Sophie's small hands wrapped around a mug of cocoa on the porch of Maple Hollow the previous summer, and Caleb standing on the dock at dusk, quietly skipping stones the way his mother had taught him, and his grandfather had taught her before that. Whatever pain this conversation caused, whatever it cost me with Vanessa in the short term, I reminded myself, sitting very still at that table, watching my daughter's carefully composed face, that the decision Harold and I had made in 2019 had never been about protecting a piece of land. It had been about protecting them. It still was. I do not know exactly what shifted in Vanessa's expression in the final moment before she finally spoke. Something settled. Or perhaps something simply exhausted itself, the shock giving way at last to a need for answers that outweighed the impulse to simply sit in silence and disbelieve what she had just heard. She straightened slightly in her chair, folded her hands together on the table in front of her, the same posture she used to strike as a girl at the dinner table when she was preparing to ask her father a question she suspected he would not want to answer. "Explain it to me," Vanessa finally said. "All of it. Slowly. Because I don't understand how you did this without telling me a single word." I tried. I told her about the spring of 2017, 6 weeks after her father's funeral, when Harold had called me into his office above the hardware store and asked me a question I had never once considered. "What happens to Maple Hollow if something goes wrong in your life, Vanessa, not mine?" I told her about the mechanics lien Harold had shown me that day, the one filed against Coleridge Estates for $11,000 owed to a paving contractor, and how Harold had explained, gently but firmly, that under Michigan law, any property held outright in her name could become fair game the moment a creditor, a lawsuit, or a divorce came looking for assets to attach. "So you didn't trust Preston," Vanessa said, and her voice had an edge to it now, quiet but sharpening. 5 years ago, before any of this, you looked at my husband and decided he was going to fail, and you protected everything from him behind my back." "I didn't decide anything about Preston specifically," I told her, and I meant it, though I understand now why it did not land the way I intended. "Harold showed me a public record, one lien, filed the same spring your father died. I didn't know what it meant for your marriage or his business. Nobody could have known any of that back then. What I knew was that your father built that cottage with his own hands, and I was not going to let it disappear into somebody else's bad year, whoever that somebody turned out to be." "Then why didn't you just leave it to me the normal way? A will, like everyone else does? Why did it have to be some irrevocable thing I wasn't even allowed to know about?" I explained it the same way Harold had explained it to me, all those years ago in that cramped office with the flapping awning outside the window. That the trust never took the cottage away from her children. It simply moved the finish line earlier so that no creditor, no lawsuit, no divorce, no single bad year could ever get between Caleb and Sophie and the place their grandfather built. That I would have my whole life to use it, to host them there every summer, and that when I was gone, it would pass to them cleanly, completely protected, exactly as it should. "You're talking about protecting them from Preston," Vanessa said, and her voice cracked slightly on his name. "That's what this is. 5 years of protecting my kids from my own husband, and you never once thought that was information I deserved to have." I want to be honest with you about how that landed, because it is the part of that conversation I have turned over the most since. She was not entirely wrong. I had made a decision, back in 2019, about what my daughter could and could not handle knowing, and I had let that decision stand, quietly, for 5 years, telling myself each year that I would explain it properly once the timing felt right. The timing, I have since learned, is very rarely something life offers you on schedule. You either say the hard thing when it is uncomfortable, or you wait until it is forced out of you at gunpoint, in a kitchen, with a stranger's pen already on the table. "You're right that I should have told you," I said quietly. "I want you to hear me say that clearly. I should have sat you down years ago and explained this the way your father would have wanted me to. Calmly, with time to ask questions, not like this. I am sorry for that part, Vanessa. I mean that. For just a moment, something in her face softened, the way it used to when she was a little girl and I would apologize for something small, a broken promise about ice cream, a canceled trip to the movies. I thought, in that brief window, that we might actually get somewhere real that afternoon. Two women, mother and daughter, finally speaking honestly about money and fear and grief in a way we had circled around for years without ever quite landing on. Her phone buzzed on the table between us. She glanced down at it, and I watched her expression change again, harden again, the softness closing over as quickly as it had opened. I did not see the screen, but I have thought about that message many times since, wondered exactly what Preston typed to her from the driver's seat of that idling car, watching us through the kitchen window, timing his entrance with a precision I would only fully understand months later, once Harold and I had assembled the full picture of how deliberately this ambush had been planned. "How much is it worth?" Vanessa asked suddenly, and the question landed strangely in the room, out of step with the conversation we had just been having. "The cottage. What's it actually worth right now?" I told her I did not know exactly, that I had never had it formally appraised, that I simply paid the property taxes on the assessed value the county sent me each year, somewhere in the low 300s, though I knew market prices around the lake had climbed considerably since Walter's father first built there in 1978. I did not yet know, sitting at that table, about the appraisal Preston had quietly commissioned back in 2017, the one that had come back at $415,000, 3 months after Walter's funeral. I did not know that my daughter, asking me that question with such sudden, sharp focus, might already have heard that number from her husband more than once. 415, she said quietly, almost to herself. That's what Preston says it would appraise at now. Easy. Maybe more. I felt something cold settle into my chest, hearing her say it so precisely, so readily, the number arriving in her mouth like something she had memorized rather than estimated. "Vanessa," I said carefully, "how long have you two been discussing what my cottage is worth?" She did not answer that directly. Instead, she looked down at the table, at the soup bowl she had barely touched, and said, in a voice that had gone thin and strained, "Mom, you don't understand how bad it's gotten. Preston hasn't slept properly in months. We had a man show up at the house in September, some collection agent for the lender, standing on our porch in front of the kids, asking when we planned to make good on what's owed. Caleb heard the whole thing through his bedroom window. I have never seen Preston that scared in 16 years of marriage." I sat with that for a moment, feeling the shape of my daughter's fear more clearly than I had at any point since she'd walked through my door that afternoon. I believed her. About the collection agent. About Caleb hearing it through the window. I still believe that part of it was true. That Vanessa was genuinely terrified, genuinely cornered, genuinely convinced that the only way to save her family from collapse was to hand over a piece of land that had never fully belonged to her to give. "I understand that you're frightened," I told her. "I do, Vanessa. But being frightened doesn't change what I can legally do. And it doesn't change what's right. That cottage was never mine to sign away to cover somebody else's mistakes. It wasn't mine to give even before the trust existed. Not really. It was always meant to end up with Caleb and Sophie.
All the trust did was make certain that happened no matter what.
So that's it, she said, and her voice had gone flat now, resigned in a way that frightened me more than her anger had. You're choosing a piece of land over your own daughter. I'm choosing my grandchildren's future over your husband's bad business decisions, I said, as gently as I knew how to make a sentence like that land. Those are not the same thing, Vanessa, even though I understand why it feels that way to you right now. She did not answer. She was looking past me now, toward the front window, and I turned to see what had caught her attention. Preston's car door opening in the driveway, the engine cutting off. A second figure I did not recognize climbing out of the passenger seat carrying a slim leather folder against her chest. I felt my stomach drop in a way that told me, before my mind had fully caught up, that whatever conversation Vanessa and I had just been having was about to become something else entirely. "Vanessa," I said carefully, "who is that?" She would not look at me. She folded the napkin one final time, set it down beside her untouched bowl, and stood up from the table just as footsteps sounded on my front porch. "Just hear them out, Mom," she said quietly. "Please, for the kids. Just hear them out before you say no to anything." I did not yet understand, in that moment, that the entire lunch, the soup, the careful confession about Coal Ridge Estates, even her own softening, apology-adjacent moment across the table, had likely been staged, at least in part, to prepare the ground for what was coming through my front door. Whether Vanessa fully understood that herself, whether she believed she was simply easing her mother into an uncomfortable conversation, or whether she already knew, on some level, that she was opening the gate for an ambush, I still do not know for certain, even now. I have chosen, for my own peace, to believe it was somewhere in between. A daughter caught between loyalty to her husband and love for her mother, making a series of small compromises that added up, in the end, to something much larger than she intended. There is one more thing she said to me before that door opened, and I have kept it back until now because of where it sits in my memory. It is the last thing my daughter ever said to me purely as my daughter, before she said everything that came after it as somebody's wife. It came out of her the moment she understood that the trust was real and that it could not be undone. "You did what?" she said, her voice rising. "You put Dad's cottage in some trust, and you never told me? 5 years ago? Mom, that's insane. That's not even legal, is it? You can undo that. People undo trusts all the time." "It's irrevocable, Vanessa. That was the point." That was when the front door opened, and Preston walked in with the notary and the leather folder, as though he had been listening from the car and had decided this was his moment. He set the folder on the table without asking, produced a fresh document, not the trust, something new, a quit-claim deed his own attorney had apparently drafted anyway, on the theory, I can only assume, that if I didn't know my own legal situation, I might sign something that contradicted it without realizing. "Eleanor," he said, using my first name the way he only did when he wanted to sound like an equal instead of a son-in-law. "Let's not make this complicated. This just puts the deed formally in Vanessa's name. Clean and simple. We'll handle the rest." I looked at that deed for a long moment. And then I looked at my daughter, who would not meet my eyes, and I understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, that this had never been a conversation. It had been an ambush from the moment she called to arrange lunch. "No," I said, and that is when Vanessa said the words I will never forget, the ones that split my life cleanly into before and after. "Sign it, Mom, or you will never see the kids again." I did not cry in front of them. I want you to know that. I have cried plenty since, in the quiet of my own kitchen, at 2 a.m, missing my grandchildren so badly it felt physical. But in that moment, I simply stood up, walked to the front door, and held it open. I think you should all go now, I said. They went. The notary first, murmuring an apology that was not really an apology. Preston next, unbothered, already on his phone before he hit the porch steps. Vanessa last, and at the door, she turned and delivered the line that would haunt me for 4 months. "You'll regret this, Mom. You have no idea what you just did." I closed the door, sat down at my kitchen table, and looked at the empty soup bowls for a long time. And then I did something that surprised even me. I picked up the phone, and I called Harold Jennings. "They came for it," I told him, my voice steadier than I expected. "Just like you thought they might." There was a long pause on the line. "Are you all right?" "I'm angry," I said. "And Harold, I think, for the first time in my life, I'm ready to actually use that." That was the last ordinary conversation I had before everything sped up. 4 days later, Vanessa sent a text informing me that she and Preston needed some space and that visits with Caleb and Sophie would be on pause for a while for the kids' emotional stability. No calls, no FaceTime. My grandchildren, cut off from me by a decision that was never theirs to make, over a piece of land they had never once asked to own. I want to be honest with you about something. For the first 2 weeks of that silence, I did nothing but grieve. I sat in that too-quiet house and I mourned Sophie's laugh and Caleb's careful teenage hugs, and I wondered whether I had made a catastrophic mistake by refusing to sign. But I made myself do one thing every single evening of those 2 weeks, whether I felt capable of it or not. I sat down at that kitchen table with a legal pad, and I wrote out the date, the time, and exactly what had and had not happened that day. Every call that did not come, every text I did not send, every hour of nothing. It felt like a ridiculous exercise for a woman nobody in her own family was speaking to. It turned out to be the first page of the only record that ever mattered. And then, on a gray Tuesday morning in late November, my phone rang, and a woman named Marissa Reyes, a fraud investigator from Lakeside Community Bank, asked me a question that changed the entire shape of what came next. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said, "I'm calling to verify a home equity application filed under your name, using a property at 14 Birch Cove Road as collateral. Did you authorize this?" I had not. I had never even applied. And in that single phone call, 2 weeks of silence turned into something I never expected. The first solid piece of evidence that what had happened at my kitchen table was not desperation, or a bad afternoon, or a family in crisis making a clumsy mistake. It was the opening move of something Preston Cole had been planning for a very long time. The application, Marissa Reyes explained to me over the phone that Tuesday morning, had come in 6 weeks earlier, filed online, using my name, my date of birth, and a social security number that matched mine exactly, requesting $150,000 against the equity of a property described as Whitfield Family Cottage, 14 Birch Cove Road, Ashford Falls. What had flagged it for review, she told me, was not the amount. It was the listed contact phone number, which belonged not to me, but to a Preston Cole. "That's my son-in-law," I said, and I heard my own voice go strange and flat, the way it does when a piece of information is too large to feel all at once. Marissa was careful, methodical, the kind of professional caution I would come to be grateful for many times over the following months. She explained that the bank could not process the application without my direct verification, that it had been sitting in a review queue, and that under Michigan law, submitting a loan application using someone else's identifying information without authorization constituted identity theft and bank fraud, regardless of the family relationship involved. "I need you to tell me clearly, Mrs. Whitfield," she said. "Did you give Preston Cole permission to use your identity to apply for this loan?" "No," I said. "I did not. I've never even discussed a loan application with him. I would have refused." There was a pause on the line, the particular kind of pause that tells you the person on the other end is writing something down. "Then I'm going to need you to come in and file a formal fraud report," she said. "And Mrs. Whitfield, I'd strongly recommend you speak with an attorney before you do anything else regarding this property." I already had one. I called Harold the moment I hung up with the bank, and by that afternoon I was sitting across from him in his office again, the same chair I'd sat in 5 years earlier, watching him take notes with the same careful precision he'd shown me when he first warned me about the mechanics lien on Coal Ridge Estates. His office had not changed much in the 5 years since I had sat in that chair to sign the trust. The same crowded bookshelves lining the walls, the same worn Persian rug that had probably outlived 2 prior tenants of the building, the same brass desk lamp casting its warm circle of light across stacks of files that never seemed to shrink, no matter how many hours Harold put into them. There was something steadying in that sameness, I remember thinking as I settled into the chair across from him that afternoon. The world outside had shifted so violently in the space of a single week. A stranger's pen on my kitchen table, my grandchildren cut off from me, now a fraudulent loan application bearing my name. And yet Harold's office remained exactly as it had always been, a small, fixed point in a landscape that otherwise felt like it was sliding out from under me. "Start from the beginning," Harold said, pen already poised over a fresh legal pad. "Everything Marissa Reyes told you, in the order she told it to you. Don't skip anything, even if it seems small. Small details are often where these cases actually live." I walked him through it as precisely as I could manage. The Tuesday morning call, the specific figure of $150,000, the property description that had used the exact phrase, "Whitfield Family Cottage," the contact number that traced back to Preston rather than to me. I told him about the review queue, about the identity verification mismatch that had flagged the file, about Marissa's careful, methodical questions, each one designed, I now understood, to build a record rather than simply satisfy her own curiosity. Harold's pen moved steadily across the legal pad as I spoke, occasionally pausing to ask me to repeat a date or a figure, but otherwise letting me talk without interruption, the way a good listener does when they understand that the person speaking needs, as much as anything, simply to be heard clearly for the first time. When I finished, he set the pen down and sat back in his chair, and I watched something settle across his face that I had not seen there before. Not surprise, I realized, but a kind of grim, careful calculation, the look of a man doing arithmetic he did not particularly enjoy. "Eleanor," he said slowly, "I want to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer, because it matters a great deal for what comes next. When Vanessa came to your house that Saturday, and later when Preston came in with the notary, did either of them, at any point, mention anything about a loan application already being in process? Anything that suggested this had already been set in motion before that afternoon?" I sat with the question for a moment, running back through that conversation at my kitchen table, the folded napkin, the number 415 arriving in Vanessa's mouth like something memorized. "No," I said finally. "Vanessa talked about a bridge solution, something Preston had worked out with a private financing company. She made it sound like a plan they were bringing to me, something that still needed my signature to move forward. She never once mentioned that an application had already been filed." 6 weeks earlier, Harold said quietly, half to himself, tapping his pen against the legal pad. "That would put the filing date sometime in mid-October, Eleanor. nearly a full month before that Saturday at your kitchen table. Which means, if what Marissa told you is accurate, Preston attempted to secure this loan using your identity well before he and Vanessa ever sat down with you to ask permission at all. I felt something cold move through me, hearing him lay it out that plainly. I had assumed, without fully examining the assumption, that the ambush at my kitchen table represented the beginning of Preston's scheme, a desperate, poorly planned attempt born out of a single afternoon's pressure. Harold's math told a different story. The pen on the table, the notary in the leather folder, all of it had come after the loan application, not before. Whatever that Saturday had actually been for, it had not been a genuine request for my permission. Permission had already been irrelevant to Preston Cole for nearly a month by the time he walked through my front door. So the ambush wasn't the plan, I said slowly, working it through out loud. It was the backup plan, in case the loan didn't clear on its own. Harold nodded, his expression grave. That's precisely what I think we're looking at. He filed the application quietly, hoping it would process before anyone at the bank thought to question a cottage with an unusual ownership history. When that started taking longer than he needed, or when something in the process made him nervous, he and Vanessa came to you directly, hoping you'd simply sign a deed that would make the whole question moot before the bank ever had to dig deeper into the title. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling the shape of it settle into something far more deliberate than I had understood it to be even an hour earlier. This had never been a single bad afternoon born of panic. It had been a plan with contingencies, built in stages, executed with a patience that felt, in its own quiet way, more unsettling than if Preston had simply lost his temper and demanded the cottage outright. What happens now? I asked. With the loan application itself, I mean. Does the bank simply close the file, or does it go further than that? Harold was quiet for a moment, choosing his words the way he always did when he wanted to be certain I understood the full weight of what he was about to say. That depends a great deal on what you decide to do in the next few days, Eleanor. The bank has already flagged this internally as a probable fraud case, but whether it becomes a formal criminal matter, whether it ever reaches a prosecutor's desk, depends largely on whether you're willing to file that fraud report Marissa asked for, and to keep filing whatever follows it. I want to be honest with you about what that could mean. Preston is your son-in-law, Vanessa's husband, the father of your grandchildren. If this moves forward the way the evidence suggests it should, it is very likely to cause real damage to your relationship with your daughter, at least in the short term. I thought of Sophie's laugh, of Caleb's careful teenage hugs, of the weeks of silence that had already stretched into something longer and colder than I had ever experienced with my own child. I thought, too, of the trust Harold and I had signed 5 years earlier, the quiet foresight that had already protected my grandchildren once, long before either of us understood how badly that protection would eventually be needed. Harold, I said, I didn't spend 5 years quietly protecting that cottage just to fold the moment protecting it actually cost me something. File the report. Whatever else happens, I want the truth documented, plainly, the same way you taught me to document everything else. Then that is exactly what we will do, Harold said. But Eleanor, I want to be very clear about what this means. Attempting to use the trust property as loan collateral is legally impossible. It isn't yours to pledge, and any competent underwriter would eventually catch that. But the fact that Preston filed the application anyway tells me he either didn't know about the trust, or he was betting the loan would clear before anyone checked the title closely. Either way, this is a man in real financial danger, moving fast and sloppy. And beyond the report? What do I do while the bank works? You let their investigation run its course, and you do not interfere with it. Harold said. "And you and I start building a record of our own. A real one, documented, dated, of everything that has happened since that Thanksgiving dinner in 2022. Because, Eleanor, I think there's a very real chance this escalates before it resolves. And if it does, we are going to want a paper trail 5 years thick, not 6 weeks thick." I did not fully understand what he meant by escalates until the second week of December, when a plain manila envelope arrived at my house with no return address, postmarked from a town 40 minutes away that I did not recognize. Inside was a single handwritten note, unsigned, and a small stack of photocopied financial documents. I want to pause here and tell you what those first weeks of silence actually felt like, because I think it matters for understanding why that envelope, when it finally arrived, hit me as hard as it did. December in Ashford Falls comes in gray and stays that way. The lake ice had not fully set yet that year, and the sky over Larkspur Lane had settled into the flat, colorless ceiling that Michigan winters bring long before the snow itself arrives. I had lived alone before. I had been a widow for 7 years by then. But I had never lived inside a silence quite like the one Vanessa built around me that November and December. A silence with edges. A silence that had been chosen rather than simply happened. I did not hear from Caleb or Sophie at all in those first 3 weeks. No calls, no texts, not even the small, ordinary things that had once filled my days without my fully noticing them. A photo of Sophie's school art project, a screenshot of Caleb's report card, the little digital confetti of an ordinary grandmother's ordinary life. My phone sat on the kitchen counter, mostly silent, and I found myself checking it anyway, a dozen times a day, the way you keep pressing on a bruise just to confirm it is still there. Doris came by most afternoons that first month, always with some small excuse. A casserole dish she needed to borrow, a question about the property line between our yards that had not actually changed in 20 years. I understood what she was really doing. She was checking on me, quietly, the way good neighbors do when they suspect a person needs company more than she is willing to admit out loud. We would sit at my kitchen table, the same table, and she would talk about ordinary things, her grandson's wrestling tournament, a sale at the pharmacy on Main Street, and let me simply exist in the company of another person for an hour before she went home. "Have you heard anything?" she asked me one afternoon in early December, stirring sugar into a cup of coffee she did not really want. "Nothing," I told her. "Not one word since the Saturday they came. I don't even know what Sophie thinks happened. I don't know what Vanessa's told her. I keep imagining she thinks I don't want to see her anymore, and there's no way for me to tell her that isn't true." Doris reached across the table and put her hand over mine, the way she had done at Walter's funeral 7 years earlier, the same steady, wordless gesture. "You did the right thing, Eleanor," she said. "I know it doesn't feel like it right now, but you did the right thing." I wanted to believe her completely. Some days I did. Other days, especially in the early evenings when the house went quiet and the light outside faded to that particular flat Michigan gray, I found myself replaying the whole afternoon at my kitchen table, wondering if there had been some other way through it, some version of that Saturday where I could have protected the cottage and kept my grandchildren both, without losing one to save the other. Harold had told me, gently, during one of our Tuesday meetings, that this kind of second-guessing was normal, that it did not mean I had made the wrong choice, only that I was a mother and a grandmother who loved deeply enough to feel the cost of every decision, even the correct ones. But it was Doris's line from that Thanksgiving porch that kept surfacing in those weeks, usually somewhere around 3 in the morning, when the house was at its quietest. Being useful to your family is not the same thing as being loved by them. I had been useful for a very long time. That winter, I was finding out exactly what had been sitting underneath it. I filed the fraud report with Marissa Reyes on the first Thursday of December, sitting in a small conference room at the Lakeside Community Bank branch on Route 9, answering questions about my identity, my social security number, my knowledge of the loan application. All of it typed carefully into a form by a young bank employee who kept apologizing, unnecessarily, for how long the process was taking. I remember driving home from that appointment in the early dark of a December afternoon, headlights cutting through a light snow that had just started falling, and feeling something I had not expected to feel yet. Not triumph, nothing so large as that, but a kind of settling, the sense that I was no longer simply absorbing what was happening to me. I was beginning, slowly, to respond to it. The mail still came every day at 2:30, the way it always had on Larkspur Lane, delivered by the same postal carrier who had covered our route for as long as I could remember, a heavy-set man named Gary, who always waved from his little truck even when he had nothing more than catalogs and utility bills to leave in my box. I want to tell you about the second Tuesday of December specifically, because I have gone over that afternoon so many times since that I can still recall the precise weather. 31 degrees, a thin skin of frost still clinging to the grass in the shadow of the porch. The particular pale color of the sky just before it starts to snow in earnest. I walked out to the mailbox a little after 3 that afternoon, later than usual, because I had spent the morning at Harold's office going over the fraud report paperwork one more time, making certain every date and figure matched what I had told Marissa Reyes. The box held the usual collection: a property tax notice, a catalog from a garden supply company I had ordered from once, years ago, and never quite managed to get off their mailing list, a card from my cousin in Grand Rapids wishing me an early Merry Christmas. And beneath all of that, a plain manila envelope, 9 by 12, my name and address typed rather than handwritten. No return address anywhere on it. Postmarked from a town called Millbrook that I did not immediately recognize, though Harold would later confirm it sat roughly 40 minutes northeast of Ashford Falls, close enough to the old Coleridge estate site to make sense of who might have mailed it. I stood at the end of my driveway for a moment, turning that envelope over in my hands, feeling its slight, unexpected weight, heavier than a simple letter, thick enough to suggest paper folded several times over. I remember a small, foolish flicker of hope moving through me before I opened it. Some part of me, I think, briefly wondered if it might be from Vanessa. A card, a note, some small olive branch sent anonymously because she was too proud or too frightened to sign her name to it. I carried it inside with the rest of the mail, set the catalog and the tax notice and the Christmas card aside on the kitchen counter, and sat down at the table with only the manila envelope in front of me. I did not open it immediately. I want to admit that to you, because I think it says something true about where my mind was in those weeks. I sat there for what felt like a long while, simply looking at my own name typed across the front of it, feeling a strange reluctance settle over me, the kind of instinct that tells you, before you have any actual information, that whatever is inside is going to matter. Outside, the first real snow of the season had begun, small flakes catching the porch light as the afternoon slid toward evening. And somewhere down the block, I could hear a neighbor's dog barking at something in the yard. Ordinary sounds from an ordinary street, entirely indifferent to whatever was about to happen inside my kitchen. Finally, I slid my thumb beneath the flap and opened it. Inside were perhaps a dozen sheets of paper, some of them photocopies of what looked like invoices and letters, and on top of the stack, a single handwritten page, the ink slightly smudged in one corner, as though the writer's hand had rested too long against the paper before it dried completely. The note read, Mrs. Whitfield. I used to work for Preston Cole at Coleridge Estates before he stopped paying his subcontractors. I think you should see what I saw. He's going to try something with your property. I'm sorry I can't put my name on this. The documents behind the note were a revelation. Copies of unpaid invoices totaling nearly $90,000. A letter from Garrett Holt, the private lender, threatening legal action if the outstanding $280,000, now grown to just over $300,000 with penalty interest, was not addressed by the end of the first quarter of 2025. And, most damning of all, an email, printed, dated the previous August, from Preston to a business associate, reading in part, My mother-in-law's lake property should clear at least $400. Once it's liquid, Holt gets paid and we're clean. Working on getting it transferred. Just a matter of the right conversation with Vanessa's mom. I sat at my kitchen table and read that email 3 times. A matter of the right conversation. That was what I had been to him. Not a mother-in-law, not a grieving widow he'd known for 18 years. A conversation to be managed, an obstacle with a predictable emotional lever, and my grandchildren had been the lever he chose to pull. I called Harold that same night, later than I usually would have. I have something you need to see, I told him. And Harold, I think it's time we stopped just protecting the cottage. I think it's time we protected the truth. He came by the next morning, read the letter and the documents twice through, and set them down on my kitchen table, the very same table, with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not surprise exactly, something closer to grim confirmation. This is enough to open a real investigation, he said quietly. Not just the bank's fraud department. This shows intent, Eleanor. Premeditation. This wasn't a man panicking in the moment. This was a plan. What followed over the next several weeks was the quietest and most deliberate season of my entire life. I want to describe it to you carefully, because I think this is the part people misunderstand most about situations like mine. There was no dramatic confrontation in December. No screaming match, no triumphant phone call to Vanessa telling her what I knew. Instead, there was simply work. Patient, unglamorous, methodical work. The kind that does not look like anything is happening from the outside, but that quietly builds the floor beneath everything that comes later. Harold and I met every Tuesday afternoon at his office through the rest of December and into January. We built what he called the file, a chronological binder, tabbed and organized, containing every piece of evidence we could lawfully gather. The original trust document from 2019. The property appraisal Preston had commissioned back in 2017, which we obtained through a public records request and which proved, conclusively, that he had been pricing the cottage while Walter's body was barely cold in the ground. The fraudulent loan application, which Marissa Reyes formally confirmed as identity theft in a written report dated the 9th of January. The anonymous envelope and its contents, which Harold had authenticated as best he could. The former employee angle checked out, he told me, through a quiet inquiry to the Michigan Licensing Board, which had 3 open wage complaints filed against Coleridge Estates that matched names in the invoices. It was slow. It was, at times, deeply lonely. I spent that Christmas alone for the first time in my life. No Caleb opening presents on my living room floor, no Sophie's small hands wrapped around a mug of hot cocoa. Vanessa sent a single text on Christmas morning. "Merry Christmas, Mom. Hope you're doing okay," that I read 4 times before deciding not to respond at all. Harold had advised me, gently but firmly, not to engage. Every conversation you have with them right now, without documentation, is a conversation they can shape into a story later, he said. Let the silence be theirs to explain, not yours. It was the hardest advice I have ever followed. Every instinct in me wanted to call Vanessa, to beg her to bring the children over, to explain, to apologize for things I had not even done wrong, simply to end the ache of missing them. I did not. Instead, I did something Harold suggested that turned out to matter more than I could have guessed at the time. I began keeping a written journal, dated entries, documenting every text, every silence, every detail of my emotional and physical state, in my own handwriting, witnessed periodically by a neighbor named Doris, who had known me for 20 years and was willing, if it ever came to it, to testify that I was of entirely sound mind. I did not yet know how important that detail would become. Neither did I know, in early January, that Preston and Vanessa were building a very different file of their own, one aimed not at protecting the cottage, but at proving in a court of law that I was no longer fit to control it. The first sign came on the 17th of January, when a certified letter arrived at my door from a firm I had never heard of, Marsh and Aldridge, attorneys at law. Inside was a notice that a petition had been filed in Ashford County Probate Court, requesting the appointment of a guardian and conservator for me, Eleanor June Whitfield, on the grounds of diminished capacity and increasing vulnerability to undue influence. The petitioner listed was my daughter, Vanessa Cole. I read that letter standing in my own front hallway, and for a moment, the floor genuinely seemed to tilt beneath me. Diminished capacity. My daughter, who had sat at my kitchen table for 100 Sunday dinners, who knew perfectly well that I balanced my own checkbook, drove myself to every appointment, and had 10 weeks earlier calmly and clearly explained the terms of an irrevocable trust to her from memory. That daughter was now asking a judge to declare me incompetent. I called Harold with my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. He was quiet for a long moment after I read him the petition over the phone. "Eleanor," he finally said, and his voice had a hardness in it I had rarely heard from him. "I want you to take a breath, and then I want you to bring that letter to my office first thing tomorrow morning. This is exactly the escalation I was worried about, and I need you to hear me clearly. This is also, very likely, the mistake that finally gives us everything we need." The petition, once we examined it fully, was built on strikingly thin material. It cited, as its central evidence, a letter from a Dr. Renner, a physician I had never met, never been examined by, who nonetheless certified, based on what the document vaguely called collateral reporting from family members, that I exhibited signs consistent with early cognitive decline, including social withdrawal, resistance to family guidance, and impaired financial judgment. Social withdrawal! I nearly laughed out loud reading it, if it had not made me so furious. My social withdrawal was 2 months of silence my own daughter had imposed on me, with no court and no doctor anywhere near the decision. My resistance to family guidance was refusing to sign away my dead husband's cottage under threat. And my impaired financial judgment, Harold pointed out, with something almost like dark satisfaction, that the only financial decision in question was the one that had protected my grandchildren's inheritance from exactly the kind of fraud their own father had since attempted. "This doctor never examined you," Harold said, flipping back through the petition. "There's no exam date, no clinical notes, no cognitive assessment attached. This is what's called a record review opinion, built entirely on second-hand reporting, meaning, almost certainly, on whatever Vanessa and Preston told him. Eleanor, this is not strong. This is desperate. But desperate people in front of a judge can still do real damage if we don't answer it properly." The hearing was set for the 11th of March, giving us 7 weeks to prepare. Harold assembled what he needed with the same patient thoroughness he'd shown from the start. He arranged for an independent geriatric psychiatric evaluation, a real one, thorough, 3 hours long, conducted by a well-regarded specialist named Dr. Anita Foss in Grand Rapids, who put me through memory tests, reasoning tests, financial literacy assessments, and at the end of it told me, with a small, kind smile, that my cognitive function tested in the high normal to superior range for my age cohort, and that she saw absolutely no clinical basis for a guardianship claim. I nearly cried in her office. It was the first time since that certified letter arrived that anyone with authority had looked at me and confirmed, out loud, what I already knew, that I was not losing my mind. I was simply the one person in my family who had refused to hand over what did not belong to anyone but my grandchildren. Harold also brought Marissa Reyes's fraud findings formally into our case file, along with a full financial history of Coleridge Estates that painted a picture far more damning than even the anonymous envelope had shown. By early February, when we finally sat down to review the complete binder together, it ran to over 200 pages, 8 years of financial records, 1 irrevocable trust, 1 confirmed identity theft, 3 unpaid subcontractor judgments against Preston's company, and a formal cognitive evaluation stating, unambiguously, that I was of entirely sound mind. "There's one more thing I think we should consider," Harold said that afternoon, tapping the folder thoughtfully. "Their petition says you are socially withdrawn and isolated. They put that in writing, under oath, in a court file. So let's ask the court to fix it. I want to file a motion asking for contact with Caleb and Sophie while this is pending, supervised at a family services office, on the record, whatever the court wants to impose. If they oppose that motion, they are standing up in front of a judge arguing against the only remedy for the exact condition they claim you have. And if they don't oppose it, you see your grandchildren. Not just for the leverage, Eleanor, because I think you need to see those children before March." I had not seen Caleb or Sophie in 12 weeks by that point. The court, not Judge Pruitt yet, a preliminary hearing officer, granted 2 hours of supervised visitation at a family services office in mid-February. And I want to tell you honestly that walking into that gray little room and seeing Sophie's face light up when she spotted me, hearing her shout, "Grandma!" and run across the carpet into my arms, undid something in me that all the careful documentation in the world had not been able to touch. "I missed you so much," she whispered into my shoulder, and I held my granddaughter for a long moment, feeling her small heartbeat against my chest before I trusted myself to speak. Caleb, 16 now and far more guarded, hung back near the door for a moment before he came and sat beside me. He did not say much during the visit. The supervisor watching from her desk made everyone stilted and careful, but as we were leaving, he pressed a folded piece of notebook paper into my hand and murmured, "Don't read it here." In the car afterward, hands still trembling from the visit, I unfolded it. It was a single sentence in Caleb's careful 16-year-old handwriting. "Grandma, I don't believe what they're saying about you. I heard Dad on the phone with someone about money and the lake house. I don't understand all of it, but I don't think it's right. Love, Caleb. I read that note perhaps a dozen times before I finally called Harold, my voice unsteady. Harold, I said, I think my grandson just handed us a corroborating witness. He was quiet for a moment. How old is Caleb again? 16. Old enough, potentially, for a judge to weigh his statement, though we'd need to be extremely careful about how, or whether, we ever put a child in the middle of this formally. I don't want Caleb testifying, Eleanor. That's not a road I want to go down unless we have absolutely no other choice. But I want you to keep that note somewhere safe. It may never need to see daylight, but it tells us something important. Even inside that house, the story they're telling isn't holding together. By the first week of March, 7 days before the hearing, Harold and I sat across from each other in his office for what he called our final preparation session. The binder was complete. Dr. Foss's evaluation was signed and notarized. Marissa Reyes had agreed, somewhat reluctantly given bank policy, to appear and testify to the fraud findings if subpoenaed. And Harold had already filed the subpoena, just to be safe. Garrett Holt's collection letters, Preston's own incriminating email, the trust documents, 8 years of appraisals and financial records. It was all there, organized, tabbed, dated, undeniable. Harold spent the better part of that final session walking me through what he called the hostile ground. The questions Dana Marsh was most likely to ask me under cross-examination, the angles she would try to work, the small inconsistencies she might attempt to manufacture out of nothing at all. He sat across the desk from me with a legal pad, playing her role with an unsettling precision that told me he had done this preparation many times before, for many other frightened clients sitting exactly where I was sitting. Mrs. Whitfield, he said, adopting a flatter, more clipped tone than his own. Isn't it true that you signed this trust only 2 years after your husband's death, during a period of significant grief? Isn't it possible your judgment was impaired? I answered the way we had practiced. Grief is not the same as incapacity, I said. I made that decision with independent legal counsel, after reviewing public financial records that concerned me. I have managed my own finances, my own household, and my own affairs without assistance every day since. If my judgment had genuinely been impaired in 2019, I doubt it would have suddenly and permanently recovered while continuing to make sound decisions for 5 consecutive years. Harold nodded, set the legal pad down for a moment. Good. Keep it exactly that plain. Don't let her rattle you into over-explaining. The moment you start justifying yourself at length, you start to sound defensive, and defensive reads, unfairly, as uncertain. Short. Factual. Let the silence after your answer do some of the work. We ran through a dozen variations of that same exchange that afternoon. Questions about my memory, about whether I had ever misplaced my keys or forgotten an appointment, about whether I had grown increasingly isolated since Walter's death, a phrase lifted almost directly from Dr. Renner's letter. Each time, Harold coached me toward the same discipline. Answer plainly, resist the urge to soften the truth into something more palatable, and never, under any circumstances, raise my voice. The moment you get emotional up there, he said, closing his notepad, even justifiably emotional, even righteously angry, Dana Marsh will use it. She'll paint it as instability. I know that's an infuriating thing to have to manage, Eleanor, being asked to stay perfectly composed while your own daughter accuses you of losing your mind. But that composure is going to be the most persuasive evidence in that entire courtroom. More than the binder, more than Dr. Foss. A woman who can sit there and answer calmly, 12 times in a row, while being accused of exactly the opposite, proves the accusation false simply by existing. I asked him that afternoon what would happen if it went badly, if Judge Pruitt, for whatever reason, was not persuaded. Harold was quiet for a moment before he answered, the kind of pause that told me he had considered the question seriously rather than simply offering reassurance. If the guardianship is granted, he said, the court would appoint someone, potentially Vanessa, potentially a neutral third party, to manage your affairs and make decisions on your behalf, including, functionally, decisions about your own living situation and your contact with others. It would not touch the trust itself. That instrument stands, regardless of your capacity. That's the entire design of it. But it would give whoever holds the guardianship enormous influence over your daily life, your access to your own funds, potentially your access to the cottage and to your grandchildren. I don't believe that's where we're headed, Eleanor, not with what we have. But I want you walking into that room with clear eyes about the stakes, not false comfort. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling the full weight of it settle into my chest. It was one thing to understand, in the abstract, that Vanessa's petition was dangerous. It was another thing entirely to hear Harold describe, in plain, careful language, exactly what my life might look like if 7 weeks of preparation were not enough. I drove out to Maple Hollow that Sunday, 2 days before the hearing, alone, without telling Harold or Doris where I was going. The cottage sat quiet under a light dusting of March snow, the lake beyond it still rimmed with ice at the shoreline, the whole property wearing the particular stillness that comes over a summer place in the wrong season, waiting. I let myself in with my own key, the same brass key I had carried on my ring for 30 years, and walked through rooms that still smelled faintly of wood smoke and cedar, even in the depths of winter. I stood for a long while at the stone fireplace Walter had built with his own hands over that brutal August in 1995, running my fingers along the mortar joints he had smoothed by hand, uneven in places, exactly the way he had left them, exactly the way I had never once wanted to have professionally repaired, because the imperfection was his signature as much as any name carved into a beam. I hope I'm doing this the way you would have wanted, I said out loud, to no one, to the empty room, to the man who had been gone for 8 years and who I still, on quiet afternoons like that one, found myself talking to as though he might answer. I hope this is what protecting them looks like. The house did not answer, of course, but I stood there long enough that the light through the west window shifted, the pale March sun dropping lower over the frozen lake, and I felt something settle in me that I had not fully felt since the afternoon Vanessa's pen had appeared on my kitchen table. Not certainty exactly, something steadier than certainty, a kind of peace with the fact that whatever happened on Tuesday, I had done everything within my power, honestly and carefully, to protect the 2 children who loved this place the way their mother once had, before circumstance and fear had pulled her somewhere else. I walked down to the dock before I left, careful on the frost-slicked boards, and stood looking out at the ice-rimmed water where Sophie had learned to swim only 18 months earlier, where Caleb had spent every summer of his life learning to skip stones the way his grandfather had taught his mother before him. I thought about the note folded in my coat pocket, the one Caleb had pressed into my hand in that gray visitation room. I don't believe what they're saying about you. And I thought about how strange it was that in a family capable of producing an ambush at a kitchen table, it had also produced a 16-year-old boy brave enough to slip his grandmother the truth on a folded scrap of notebook paper. That was the anchor, I think, if I am honest with you about what actually carried me through those 7 weeks of preparation. Not the binder, thick as it was, not even Harold's steady, patient competence, invaluable as it proved to be. It was the knowledge that somewhere inside that house on the other side of town, At least one of my grandchildren already understood, in his own quiet 16-year-old way, that something was deeply wrong, and had chosen, at real risk to himself, to tell me so. I drove home from the cottage in the early dark, the roads mostly empty, the radio off, thinking through the 2 days that remained before the hearing. Doris had insisted on coming by that evening with dinner, and I found her sitting on my porch steps when I pulled into the driveway, a covered dish balanced on her knees, waiting for me in the cold rather than simply letting herself in with the spare key I had given her years ago. "I didn't want to intrude if you needed the house to yourself," she said, standing up stiffly as I approached. "But I also didn't want you eating alone 2 nights before the biggest day of this whole ordeal." We ate at the kitchen table, the same table, and Doris talked me through small, ordinary things, her granddaughter's upcoming wedding, a neighbor 2 streets over who had finally sold the house that had sat empty since autumn, the kind of gentle, undemanding conversation that asks nothing of you except your presence. Near the end of the evening, as she was gathering her coat, she paused at the door and looked back at me with an expression I had come to recognize over the past 4 months, somewhere between fierce and tender. "Whatever happens Tuesday," she said, "I want you to remember something. You didn't do anything wrong, Eleanor. Not in 2019, not in November, not any day since. You protected 2 children who couldn't protect themselves. If anybody in that courtroom tries to make you feel small for that, you look them dead in the eye and you remember exactly who you are." I hugged her longer than I usually did, standing in my own doorway with the cold March air pressing in around us. And after she drove away, I sat alone in the quiet of my living room for a long while. The binder Harold had prepared resting closed on the coffee table in front of me. 200 pages of careful, patient work standing between my family and whatever Tuesday might bring. I slept poorly that Sunday night, the way you might expect, drifting in and out of a shallow, restless sleep filled with fragments of things: Walter's voice, Sophie's laugh, the sound of Vanessa's pen tapping against my kitchen table. By the time my alarm sounded at 6 the next morning, I was already awake, already dressed, already standing at my kitchen window watching the gray dawn come up slow and pale over Larkspur Lane. 1 full day still remaining before I would have to walk into that courtroom and find out whether 7 weeks of quiet, careful preparation would be enough to hold back everything that had been building against me since the moment my son-in-law first priced my husband's cottage over a Thanksgiving turkey a little over 2 years earlier. Harold came by the house that Monday evening, the night before the hearing, and set the binder down on my kitchen table between us. His voice was steady, but it carried a note of seriousness I had not heard from him before, not even during our most difficult preparation sessions. "There's one more decision I need you to make," Harold said, closing the binder gently. "The hearing is public record, Eleanor. Vanessa and Preston will be in that room. If this goes the way I believe it will, based on everything we have, they are going to be facing not just the collapse of their petition, but very likely a criminal referral for the loan fraud. I need you to be certain, going in, that you're prepared for what that looks like, for your daughter, in front of a judge, watching her own case dismantled by her mother's evidence." I sat with that question for a long moment. I thought of Vanessa as a little girl skipping stones off the dock at Maple Hollow, her father's hand steady on her shoulder. I thought of the woman who had sat at my kitchen table in November, refusing to meet my eyes while her husband set a pen down like a verdict. And I thought, most of all, of Sophie's small arms around my neck in that gray visitation room, and Caleb's folded note in my coat pocket. "I'm ready," I told Harold. "I didn't build this to punish her. I built it to protect them. If protecting them means she has to finally see what Preston's been doing, then that's a truth she needs to see, whether it's comfortable or not." Harold nodded slowly, closed the binder, and set it squarely in front of him. "Then I think," he said, "we're ready for the 11th of March." The Ashford County Probate Court occupied the second floor of a limestone building that had stood on Main Street since 1911, and I remember the particular sound of my own low heels against its worn marble steps that morning, the 11th of March, a Tuesday, cold and clear, the kind of hard blue sky that makes everything look sharper than it is. Harold walked beside me carrying the binder, now bound in a formal legal folder, along with 3 additional exhibits he had prepared over the final weekend. I wore a simple gray wool dress, the most understated thing in my closet, no jewelry beyond my wedding ring, because Harold had told me plainly, "Eleanor, today is not a day for making an impression. Today is a day for looking exactly like what you are. A clear-headed, unremarkable, entirely competent woman being dragged into a courtroom by people who underestimated her." Vanessa and Preston were already seated at the petitioner's table when we entered, alongside their attorney, a sharp-featured woman named Dana Marsh, who I recognized from the letterhead of that first certified letter. Vanessa did not look at me as I walked in. Preston did, briefly, with an expression of mild, confident boredom that I understood, later, as the look of a man who genuinely believed he had already won. Judge Corinne Pruitt entered a few minutes later, a woman in her early 60s with sharp, tired eyes that had clearly presided over 1,000 family disputes uglier than most people could imagine, and who did not waste time on preamble. "This is a petition for guardianship and conservatorship over Eleanor June Whitfield," she said, glancing down at the file. "Petitioner is Vanessa Cole, daughter of the respondent. Ms. Marsh, you may proceed." Dana Marsh's opening was polished, I will give her that. She painted a picture of a beloved elderly mother in decline, isolated since her husband's death, increasingly resistant to family involvement, making legal decisions years ago, she said carefully, of questionable judgment, decisions she may not have fully understood the consequences of, referring obliquely to the trust without yet naming it directly. She called Dr. Renner first. Dr. Renner's testimony took perhaps 20 minutes, and it fell apart faster than I expected. Under Harold's cross-examination, the doctor admitted, plainly, that he had never conducted an in-person examination of me, that his letter had been based entirely on a phone consultation with Vanessa and Preston, during which they described behaviors he characterized on the stand as consistent with possible cognitive concerns. Harold asked him one question that seemed to hang in the air of the courtroom for a long moment. "Doctor, in your professional letter, you wrote that Mrs. Whitfield exhibited, quote, resistance to family guidance. Can you tell the court what specific family guidance she was resisting?" Dr. Renner hesitated. "I was told she had refused to sign a property transfer requested by her family." "And are you aware," Harold said quietly, "that the property in question had been placed in an irrevocable trust for her grandchildren 5 years prior to that request, meaning she was legally incapable of signing it away even if she had wanted to?" Dr. Renner's face changed. "I was not made aware of that, no." Dana Marsh called Vanessa next as her own witness and had her testify to a narrative of my supposed decline, of me seeming forgetful at recent visits, of concerning comments I had allegedly made about finances. She was careful, rehearsed, and I sat and listened to my own daughter describe a version of me I did not recognize. My hands folded tightly in my lap. Harold's steady presence beside me the only thing keeping my composure intact. It was on cross-examination that everything began to turn. Harold approached the witness stand slowly, the binder in his hand, and began not with the guardianship claim at all, but with a single question. Mrs. Cole, are you aware of a home equity loan application filed in your mother's name on the 15th of October last year in the amount of $150,000, using the Birch Cove Road property as collateral? Vanessa's face went very pale. I don't know anything about that. Your mother certainly didn't authorize it, Harold said, because it was never her application to begin with. It was filed using her identity information by your husband, Preston Cole, whose contact number appears directly on the submission. Lakeside Community Bank's Fraud Investigation Unit confirmed this in a written report dated the 9th of January, which I have entered as Exhibit F. He set a copy in front of the judge. Your Honor, at this time, I'd like to call Marissa Reyes to the stand. Vanessa turned, for the first time all morning, and looked directly at Preston. Preston did not look back at her. He was staring straight ahead, jaw tight, a muscle working in his cheek. Marissa Reyes's testimony was clinical, precise, and devastating in its calm delivery. She walked the court through the application, the IP address it had been filed from, which traced back to Preston's own office at Coleridge Estates, the identity verification mismatch that had flagged the file for review, and the formal fraud determination the bank had issued in January. This application constitutes attempted identity theft and financial fraud under Michigan law, she stated plainly, and the bank's findings have been forwarded to the county prosecutor's office for review. The courtroom was very quiet after that. Judge Pruitt made a note, her expression unreadable, but her pen moving with unmistakable purpose. Dana Marsh, to her credit, seemed to sense the ground shifting beneath her case, and I watched her lean over and murmur something urgently to Vanessa, who was staring down at the table, her hands pressed flat against it as though trying to hold herself steady. It was my turn to testify after the recess. Harold had prepared me carefully. Answer plainly, he'd said. Don't perform. Don't over-explain. Let the facts stand on their own. I walked to the stand, and I told the truth, in the same voice I might use to tell someone the weather. I explained the trust, why Harold and I had created it in 2019, the mechanics lien that had prompted the conversation. I explained the pattern of comments about the cottage's value going back to that Thanksgiving in 2022. I explained the anonymous letter, the fraudulent loan application, and finally, the afternoon in my own kitchen when my daughter told me to sign or lose my grandchildren. Did you understand, Mrs. Whitfield, that you were legally unable to transfer that property at the time your daughter demanded it? Harold asked me.
Yes, I said. I told her exactly that same afternoon. I told her the cottage was in trust for her own children. She did not seem to want to hear it. Dana Marsh, on cross-examination, tried valiantly to salvage something. She pressed me on memory lapses, on isolation, on whether grief had clouded my judgment in 2019 when I signed the original trust. I answered each question plainly, and I watched, with something between grief and grim satisfaction, as Judge Pruitt's expression grew steadily more skeptical of the petition sitting in front of her. When Harold called Dr. Anita Foss to the stand late that afternoon, her testimony landed like the final stone in a wall we had spent 2 months building. She walked through her 3-hour evaluation in careful clinical detail: the memory assessments, the reasoning tests, the financial literacy screening, and concluded simply: Mrs. Whitfield's cognitive function tested in the high normal to superior range for her age cohort. I found no clinical evidence whatsoever to support a claim of diminished capacity. Judge Pruitt looked over her glasses at Dana Marsh. "Counsel," she said, "does your client wish to proceed further with this petition, or would this be an appropriate time to revisit its viability, given what the court has heard today?" There was a long pause at the petitioner's table. I watched Vanessa's shoulders drop, watched something in her posture finally crack, and for the first time since that November afternoon, I saw, beneath the anger and the fear, the shape of my daughter again, lost, frightened, and beginning, I think, to understand exactly what she had let Preston pull her into. Dana Marsh requested a brief recess to confer with her clients, and Judge Pruitt granted 20 minutes. Harold and I stepped into the hallway, and I stood by the tall window at the end of the corridor, looking down at Main Street, at the hardware store where this had all quietly begun 8 years earlier, and I let myself breathe for what felt like the first time all day. "How are you holding up?" Harold asked quietly. "I don't know yet," I admitted. "I thought I'd feel triumphant. Mostly, I just feel tired." "That's normal," he said. "You've been carrying this for 4 months. Today isn't the end of that. But Eleanor, I think you should know, whatever happens in the next 20 minutes, you've already won the part that matters most. The trust held. Your grandchildren are protected. Nothing that happens next changes that." When we returned to the courtroom, something had visibly shifted at the petitioner's table. Preston sat rigid, arms crossed, staring at a point on the wall above the judge's bench. Vanessa's eyes were red-rimmed. Dana Marsh rose first. "Your Honor," she said, "given the evidence presented today, my clients wish to withdraw the petition for guardianship." Judge Pruitt nodded slowly, unsurprised. "The petition is withdrawn and dismissed with prejudice," she said. "I will also note, for the record, that this court is deeply troubled by the evidence presented today regarding a fraudulent loan application, and I am directing the clerk to forward the complete record, including the bank's fraud investigation findings, to the Ashford County Prosecutor's Office for review." She looked directly at Preston as she said it, and for the first time all day, I watched his composure genuinely falter. "Additionally," the judge continued, "given the pattern described in testimony today, specifically, the conditioning of grandchildren's visitation on the transfer of property the respondent did not legally possess, I am not prepared to sign a dismissal that leaves that arrangement quietly standing. Ms. Marsh, before this file closes, I want to know on the record whether your clients will stipulate to reasonable, unsupervised grandparenting time for Mrs. Whitfield to be entered as an order of this court today. If they will not, I will refer this matter to the Family Division of the Circuit Court myself this afternoon, with a certified copy of this morning's transcript attached, and they can make that argument over there." Dana Marsh leaned toward her clients. The conversation at that table lasted less than a minute. When she straightened up, her voice was flat and very careful. "My clients so stipulate, Your Honor." "Then it is so ordered," Judge Pruitt said, and signed it while I was still holding my breath. "Reasonable, unsupervised visitation with Caleb and Sophie Cole, effective immediately, absent any further order of a court of competent jurisdiction."
I do not know how to fully describe what I felt hearing those words. 4 months of silence, of missing bedtime stories and basketball games, and Sophie's drawings of the lake, undone in under a minute, at a table I was not even sitting at, by a judge I had met only that morning. I did not cry in the courtroom. I saved that for the car, where Harold sat beside me for a long moment, letting me simply exist inside the relief before either of us said anything at all. The weeks that followed moved faster than the 4 months that had preceded them. The Ashford County Prosecutor's Office opened a formal investigation into Preston within days, and by late April, he had been charged with identity theft and attempted financial fraud, both felonies under Michigan law. Garrett Holt, the private lender, filed his own civil suit for the outstanding balance shortly after. $311,000, with interest. And Coleridge Estates, already a skeleton of unfinished lots and unpaid contractors, was placed into receivership by summer. Vanessa called me for the first time in early April, nearly 3 weeks after the hearing. I almost did not answer. When I did, her voice was smaller than I had heard it in years. "Mom," she said, "I need to tell you I'm sorry. Not the kind of sorry I've said before. I mean it this time. I let him convince me you were the problem, when the whole time—" her voice broke. "The whole time it was him. And I let it cost me 4 months with my own kids seeing their grandmother, because I was too scared to ask the right questions." I did not forgive her instantly. I want to be honest about that, because I think honesty matters more in a moment like this than a tidy ending. I told her that I loved her, that I always would, but that trust, real trust, the kind that lets a mother welcome her daughter fully back into her life, would need to be rebuilt slowly, on actions, not apologies delivered under legal pressure. She said she understood. I believed, for the first time in a long while, that she meant it. Preston, for his part, did not apologize to me at all. He pled guilty to a reduced charge that summer. The prosecutor accepted a plea to a single felony count in exchange for restitution and a recommendation of probation rather than prison, given it was a first offense. But the damage to his reputation in Ashford Falls was thorough, and, I suspect, permanent. Vanessa filed for divorce in June. I did not celebrate that. I grieved it, quietly, for the marriage my daughter had once believed in, and for the version of Preston Cole who had, briefly, seemed like he might become a good husband and father. That version, it turned out, had never fully existed. By the 4th of July, 8 months after the pen had been set down on my kitchen table, Caleb and Sophie spent the holiday weekend with me at Maple Hollow, the way they had every summer of their lives before the silence began.
Sophie ran straight down to the dock the moment we arrived, shrieking with the particular joy only an 8-year-old near water can produce. And Caleb, taller now than he'd been in March, helped me carry the cooler up from the car without being asked, the way his grandfather used to. That evening, we sat on the porch Walter built with his own hands in 1995, watching the sun go down gold and pink over Lake Serrano. And Sophie asked me, out of nowhere, the way children do, "Grandma, is this always going to be our lake house, even when we're grown up?" I looked at her for a long moment. This small, fierce, curious girl who had run into my arms in a gray visitation room without a moment's hesitation, who loved this place with the same uncomplicated devotion her grandfather had. "Yes, sweetheart," I told her. "This will always be yours. Yours and your brother's. no matter what happens to anyone else. That was decided a very long time ago, before you were even born, because your grandfather and I loved you both enough to make absolutely sure of it." She did not fully understand what I meant. Not yet. But Caleb, sitting quietly on the porch step, looked over at me and nodded once, slowly, the way a boy does when he has grown up faster than anyone wanted him to, and understands more than he says. Vanessa came to visit that same weekend, alone, staying at a small inn in town rather than the cottage, a boundary I had asked for gently, and she had accepted without argument. We sat together on the dock one evening after the kids had gone to bed, watching fireflies rise off the water the way they had every summer of her own childhood. "I keep thinking about that day in the kitchen," she said quietly. "What I said to you. I've replayed it 100 times, Mom. Sign, or you'll never see the kids." Her voice caught. I can't believe those words came out of my own mouth. I was quiet for a moment, watching the light fade over the water. "You know," I finally said, "I've thought about that day too. And I think, in the end, it wasn't really you who never got to see the kids, Vanessa. It was Preston. He's the one who lost that, permanently, because of what he actually did, not what he threatened. You said those words out of fear and bad advice. He earned every consequence that followed with his own hands, 8 years in the making." She started crying then, quietly. The kind of crying that comes from somewhere much deeper than a single conversation. "I almost lost you over a piece of land," she said. "I almost lost my own children's grandmother over $400,000 that was never even mine to take." "You didn't lose me," I told her, and I meant it. "You came close, but you're here now. And Vanessa, the version of you sitting on this dock tonight, the one who drove up here alone to apologize and stayed at the inn because I asked her to, without arguing. That's the daughter I raised. I think she got buried for a while under someone else's plans. I'm glad to see her again." It has been almost a year now since that afternoon in my kitchen, since a stranger's pen sat waiting on my table, and my daughter told me I would never see my grandchildren again. The cottage still stands on Birch Cove Road, exactly where Walter's father built it in 1978. Exactly where Walter expanded it with his own hands in 1995. It will belong to Caleb and Sophie one day, fully and completely, protected from every storm that might otherwise have come for it. A lender's collection call, a failed business, a desperate man's spreadsheet. Vanessa visits every few weeks now, slowly, carefully, rebuilding something that was never going to repair itself overnight. And I let her, because I believe, finally, that she is doing it for the right reasons. I think often about that conversation in Harold's office back in 2019, the one I almost postponed, the one that felt, at the time, like an unnecessary precaution for a problem I could not yet see coming. I think about how easy it would have been to skip it, to trust that family simply protects itself, that love is enough of a safeguard against greed. It is not. I learned that the hardest way a mother can learn anything. If there is one thing I would want you to carry away from my story, it is this. Protecting the people you love sometimes means making decisions they will not understand, or will not thank you for, until years later when the storm finally arrives and they discover the roof was already reinforced. My neighbor Doris told me once, standing on my cold porch after a Thanksgiving dinner I have never forgotten, that being useful to your family is not the same thing as being loved by them, and that the day you stop being useful is the day you find out which one you had. She was right. I found out.
I would tell you it was worth finding out, even at that price, because you cannot protect anyone from a thing you refuse to look at directly. Silence is not weakness. Preparation is not betrayal. And the people who count on your compliance, who assume an aging woman with a lake house is an easy problem to solve, are very often the ones most astonished to discover exactly how much strength was quietly sitting across the table from them all along. Have you ever had to stand your ground against your own family, even when it cost you dearly in the moment? I would love to hear your story in the comments below. You are not alone, and neither was I. If this story meant something to you, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more stories just like it. Thank you for sitting with me through this one. I will see you in the next story.